The hands are shaking, and not from fear. Belgium. December 1944. The cold is a living thing. It gets under the fingernails, into the joints, into the marrow. An American soldier stands in a churned-up field outside a village called Bullingen, and his fingers can barely close around the handle of a jerrycan. 5 gallons of gasoline, almost 40 pounds of it. He lifts, he tilts, he pours. The fuel goes into the tank of a German Panther. Above him on the turret, a machine sits pointed down at the crown of his head. Behind the gun, a boy in a padded winter smock watches him work. Nobody is speaking. There is nothing to say. There is only the sound of the liquid running down the funnel, the cough of an idling engine, the wind coming off the Ardennes ridgeline like a blade. Remember this image. A captured American, half frozen, feeding the German war machine with his own hands. Remember his hands. It's because in a few hours, this tank will drive away, and it will stop at a crossroads called Baugnes, and American prisoners will be standing in a field with their hands up. Most of them were 19 years old, and not one man ever hanged for what happened to them. Because the entire offensive, the last great German attack of the Second World War, the one that will kill 19,000 Americans in 6 weeks, is built on that poor. Not on tanks, not on paratroopers, not on Hitler's genius, on stolen gasoline, and it will not be enough. 3 men, 3 places, the same month. The first is in Berlin. Albert Speer, 39 years old, Minister of Armaments, the architect, who became the manager of a nation's destruction. He wears a well-cut suit, he has beautiful handwriting, and he has spreadsheets. Long columns of numbers that tell him, with the mercy of a diagnosis and the finality of a death certificate, that Germany is out of fuel. Speer knows. He has known for months. The second is in the fog west of the Rhine. Joachim Peiper, 29, SS Obersturmbannführer, commander of a spearhead of tanks that is about to be pushed into the American line like a knife into a rib cage. He is handsome in the way propaganda photographers love. He is decorated. He is a favorite. And he has been handed an order to attack across 125 miles of hills and hairpin roads, with less fuel than the distance requires. Pieper knows this too. He says so out loud. He is told to go anyway. The third man knows nothing. Virgil Larry, 27, a first lieutenant of American Field Artillery, is riding south in a convoy of trucks toward a town called St. Vith. He is a forward observer, a man whose job is to see. He has spent this war watching the horizon so that shells can fall where they are needed. He has no idea he is driving into the worst day of his life. He has no ideas that his name will zand allude in a war court, or that he skudel stist fobelefrodge and be asked to walk down a line of prisoners and point. Right now, he is just cold. Right now, he is just a man in a truck in the last hours of the ordinary world. Go back 7 seconds. May 1944. Speer is looking at the aviation fuel figures, and what he sees is not a decline. It is a collapse. In April, German plants produce roughly 175,000 tons of aviation gasoline. Then the Allied bombers find the synthetic fuel plants, Luna, Politz, the great chemical cathedrals that turn coal into war, and they come back, and they come back, and they come back. By September, it has collapsed to a fraction of that. That would vary depending on who is counting, and every one of them is a catastrophe, not a cut, not a shortfall, an amputation. And aviation fuel was only the first to die. Motor fuel, the gasoline that moves tanks, went down the same staircase, from the same bombed refineries, month after month. When the planes stop flying, the tanks are next. They are drinking from the same well. Speer writes it down. He puts it in front of Hitler. He uses the plainest language he is capable of using, which for Speer is still a language of committees and quotas, but the meaning is unmistakable. The fuel is gone, and without fuel there is no air force, and without an air force there are no tanks, because tanks that cannot move are only steel coffins with treads. Hitler listens. Hitler nods. And Hitler plans an offensive that will require thousands of vehicles to drive 100 miles through winter mountains. That is the thing you must understand about December 1944. It was not a gamble taken in ignorance. The men had the numbers. They had them in writing. They chose the attack anyway, because the alternative was to admit out loud, in a bunker, that it was over. The arithmetic of failure was already done. All that remained was to send the young men out to solve for the remainder. And here we should be honest about Joachim Peiper, because history is not a film, and he is not the tragic hero. Before he commanded tanks, he was Heinrich Himmler's adjutant. He carried the man's papers. He sat in the anterooms. He was in the machine's central nervous system in the years when the machine was designing the murder of Europe's Jews. And he traveled to the east, and he saw what was there to be seen. After the war, American investigators went through the German planning documents. They interviewed the officers. They audited the logistics. And what they found was not a mistake. It was a confession. The German planners admitted it themselves. The Ardennes offensive was not planned with enough fuel and then unluckily ran short. It was planned around the assumption that it would not have enough fuel. The whole concept depended on capturing Allied gasoline dumps along the way. The columns were issued enough to go somewhere between 80 and 95 miles. The objective, Antwerp, was 125 miles away. Read that again so slowly. The plan required stealing the fuel to finish the plan. There is a word for a military operation that cannot succeed without the enemy's cooperation. The word is not bold. The word is not even desperate. The word is fantasy. Hitler sent 100,000 men into the snow with a full tank of gasoline and an empty tank of hope and told them to fill the difference with luck. It was not an oversight. It was a sentence written in advance, and the young men in the Panthers were the ones who had to serve it, which means the entire offensive had a single point of failure. Not a fortress, not a river. Time. Peiper did not need to win battles. He needed to not lose hours. Every hour he was stopped was fuel burning in an idling engine going nowhere. Every hour was a mile that would never be driven. His whole campaign was a candle, and it was already lit. So all it would take to kill the last German offensive of the war, all it would take, was a handful of men standing in a road, refusing to move. 18 of them, as it turned out. On a hillside above a village called Lanzerath, in a line of foxholes dug by Smossiels and inherited without ceremony, sat intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. 18 men and a 4-man artillery observation team who happened to be there and chose to stay. Their commander was a lieutenant named Lyle Book. He was 20 years old. He had lied about his age to get into the National Guard at 14. He had been made an officer at 18. He had trained his men obsessively, and they were good. They were better than good. And on the morning of the 16th of December, when the German artillery came down like the sky splitting open, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. What came up the hill toward them was the leading edge of the entire northern attack. German paratroopers, hundreds of them, wave after wave, walking up an open slope in daylight. And the road behind those Germans, the road that had to be cleared, the road that was written into the Tamtoya ink, was Joachim Peiper's road. The 18 fought all day. They fought until their machine-gun barrel warped. They fought until the German dead were lying in the field below them in rows. They fought until dusk came down over the Ardennes, and the ammunition ran to nothing, and the Germans finally came in behind them and put rifles against their backs. Buch was hit in the leg. A round tore across his face. They took him to the cafe in Lanzerath, laid him on the floor among the wounded of both armies, and left him there in the dark. At midnight, someone's watch chimed the hour. Lyle Buch lay bleeding on the floorboards of an enemy aid station and understood that it was now the 17th of December, and that he was 21 years old. That was his birthday. That was how he spent it. His first full day as a prisoner of war. Down the road outside, engines were snarling in the dark. Peiper's column, jammed, furious, hours late. Burning fuel it did not have while it waited for a village that 18 Americans had refused to hand over on schedule. Historians still argue about exactly how many hours those men cost Joachim Peiper. Some say 16. Nobody argues that they cost him the day. And on this road, in this campaign, a day was everything. And here is the last thing, the thing that hollows you out. Book did not know. He limped into captivity believing he had failed. He had lost his position. He had lost his platoon. Every man of them was killed, wounded, or captured. In the ledger, a soldier keeps in his own head. He had been given a hill and had not held it, and that was the end of the story. He carried that for years. He did not know that the hours he stole were the most expensive hours of the entire German offensive. He did not know that the spearhead never got them back. He did not know that the candle he had shortened was still burning down, mile after mile, all the way to a place he would never see. He did not know he had won. It took the United States 37 years to tell him. Not until 1981 did his platoon receive the Presidential Unit Citation, and by then some of them were dead, and all of them were old. 37 years for a country to look at 18 men and finally say, you were the hinge, but that is later. That is decades away. For if now it is still the 17th of December, and the morning is gray, and somewhere near Malmedy, a lieutenant named Virgil Larry is sitting in a truck in a convoy watching the road, seeing nothing unusual at all. By 1 o'clock this afternoon, he will be lying face down in a field under the bodies of his friends. Hansfeld, before the sun. December 17th, 1944. It is not really a village. It is a road with a house on it, a church, a few barns, a crossroads that nobody would remember if the war had gone around it instead of through it. American soldiers are asleep in those barns. Stragglers, drivers, replacements, rear echelon men, boys who have been told that the Ardennes is a quiet sector, a rest area, a place where nothing happens, where you go to get warm and get your boots dried and write a letter home about how there is nothing to write about. At 4 in the morning, the tanks come. They come down the road with their headlights on. That is the detail that turns a man's stomach when he first hears it. They come with their lights on, because Pittsburgh's crews have learned that an American sentry in the dark, seeing headlights, assumes those lights must be American. Nobody drives with lights on in any so the sentry lowers his rifle and squints, and by the time he understands, the hatches are already open. Men in padded winter smocks drop down into the mud and start kicking indoors. The Americans come out with their hands up. Some of them are in their socks. Some of them still have blankets around their shoulders. Some are so deep in the fog of sleep and cold that they are smiling in confusion, the way a man smiles when he cannot yet make sense of what he is looking at. They are put against the walls of the houses. Nobody has ever written a complete account of the next 4 minutes, because the men who could have written it did not survive it. What we have is what was found later, when the snow melted and the graves registration teams came up the road with their stretchers and their clipboards and their little canvas bags for personal effects. 19 Americans. That is the count we have, shot where they stood. Some of them still had their hands raised when they were found, frozen that way, arms up, in the position of surrender. Some had been bayoneted. One, the report said, had been crushed. This is before Malmedy, hours before Malmedy. History gave the name of the massacre to the crossroads that came later, and that is right and just, because more men died there. But it means that Hansfeld slipped out of the story. It means that the killing that began this day, the killing that told you everything you needed to know about what was coming down that road, is a footnote. So hold it for a second. Before you hear another word, it started in the dark, with sleeping men, and it started with laughter. And nobody at the top of the German army was surprised. Now here is the thing almost nobody tells you. Pieper had a route. It was not a suggestion. It was the spine of the entire northern attack, drawn on a map at headquarters, given a name, Rollbahn D, and assigned to his Kampfgruppe the way rails are assigned to a train. Stay on it. Push down it. Do not wander. And on the morning of the 17th, Joachim Pieper looked at his fuel gauges and left it. He turned off the road he had been ordered to take. He swung his column toward a town called Bullingen, not because the objective lay that way, not because the enemy forced him, not because a bridge was down, because there was a rumor of gasoline. Sit with that. the most aggressive armored commander in the German army, leading the spearhead of the last great offensive of the Third Reich, Ike abandoning his ordered line of advance on the second morning of the operation. Not under pressure, not under fire, because he was thirsty. Everything we established in the first part, the plan built on the assumption of stolen fuel, the sentence written before the trial, stops being a theory right there. By 7 o'clock on the second day, the offensive was no longer running on a plan. It was running on a hunt, and a hunt does not go where the map says. A hunt goes where the prey is. That is the exact moment the German attack stopped being commanded by Joachim Pieper and started being commanded by his fuel gauge. Bullingen. 50,000 gallons of American gasoline stacked in 5-gallon cans in a field beside a little airstrip, guarded by men who had no earthly idea that an SS armored column was about to come out of the fog on a road it was never supposed to be on. The Germans take it in minutes. There is barely a fight. There is barely time for one. And now we are back at the image we started with in the very first minute of this story. The Americans captured at Bullingen are marched out to the vehicles. They are handed the cans. They are made to do the work. Picture him, 20 years old. His hands are blue. His fingers do not close properly anymore. Anybody who has been cold, really cold, the kind of cold that gets into the joints, knows that your hands stop being yours after a while. He lifts a jerrycan that weighs almost 40 pounds, and he braces it against the fender of a Panther, and he pours leaning into the engine of the machine that is going to be used to kill his countrymen before dark. And when the can is empty, they hand him another one. The German crews are cheering. That is not a flourish. That is in the record. They stood up on the engine decks in the cold and hollered like men at a bulbog while American prisoners fed their tanks. Some of them were laughing. Some of them were slapping the armor. For 1 hour in a muddy field in eastern Belgium, the war looked to them like it was turning around. They filled the tanks. They filled the spare cans. They filled every container that would hold liquid, and then they filled the drums. And then they stood there breathing hard in the freezing air, and Joachim Pieper, who had spent every single hour of this operation staring at a needle, felt for the first and last time in the whole campaign something close to relief. It was the most expensive hour of his life. Because here is what Pieper did not know. High standing in that field, watching the fuel go in. North of Bullingen, dug into the high ground toward Elsenborn, sat the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. 2 full divisions, and their supply line, their lifeline, their rear, their soft belly, ran directly through the ground he was standing on. He had come in behind them. At that moment, at that hour, with those tanks, Joachim Pieper was sitting squarely on the artery of 2 American divisions, and they did not know he was there, and he did not know they were there. Historians have argued about this ever since, and they will argue about it forever. If he had turned north that morning, he might have rolled those divisions up from behind. He might have cut them off from their ammunition, their food, their fuel. He might have broken the northern shoulder of the American line, and the northern shoulder is the whole story. That shoulder, Elsenborn Ridge, is precisely what refused to break. It is what channeled the entire German Fussel offensive into a narrowing corridor and choked it. It is the hinge on which the Battle of the Bulge turned. It was there for the taking. Behind him, 2 miles away, unaware. He never saw Sebist. He was looking down at the cans, so he turned south instead, back toward his routes, back toward the next rumor of gasoline, and he left behind him, untouched and unmolested, the very force that would eventually destroy him. Understand what this means. The fuel did not merely slow the offensive down. The fuel made him blind. He went hunting for the thing he needed in order to win. He drove straight past the victory itself and never turned his head. 1 o'clock in my afternoon, the same day. A crossroads 2 miles southeast of Malmedy, a place called Baugnes. There is a signpost, a stone farmhouse, a cafe, and a field that slopes gently away to the south. In summer, it is nothing. In December, it is Bite White Ground. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion comes up the road in a column of trucks and jeeps. Around 140 men. They are not combat troops in the way you are picturing. They are observers. Their job is to see, to find the enemy, calculate the range, and call the guns down on him from miles away. They are technicians. They carry carbines and a couple of machine guns, and that is the extent of it. In one of those vehicles is a first lieutenant named Virgil Leary. You met him in the first part of this story. 27 years old, riding south, knowing nothing. That was yesterday's man. As he has about 90 days left of being him. At the crossroads, the column turns, and the lead German tank comes over the rise and opens fire. It is not a battle. It is a demolition. The first rounds smash the lead vehicles and the trailing vehicles, and the column is corked at both ends. And the men dig out into ditches with small arms against armor, which is another way of saying with nothing at all. Within minutes, it is finished. They come out with their hands on their heads. About 113 of them, by most accounts. Some sources say closer to 120. They are searched. Rings come off. Watches come off. Wallets, cigarettes, gloves. A photograph of somebody's wife falls in the mud and gets stepped on. Then they are herded into the open field beside the cafe. They stand there in the open. Prisoners of war, disarmed, hands up, in the snow, in Belgium in the middle of the afternoon. For a while, nothing happens. Some of them are talking quietly. Some are shaking from the cold. Some of them, and survivors said this afterward, and it is the detail that breaks you. Some of them actually believed they were about to be marched to the rear. Some of them were relieved. For a man in that field, at that minute, the war was over, and he was going to live. Then a vehicle at the edge of the road turns, and its machine gun comes around, and it points into the field. There is a single pistol shot, then a second, then everything. Machine gun fire into a crowd of standing men does not sound like the pictures. It is not a rattle. At that range, it is a solid wall of noise, and the men in front simply fold, and the men behind them are pushed forward by the men behind them, and the bodies begin to stack, and men who have not been touched fall anyway, because there is nowhere left to go but down. Virgil Leary goes down. He is not hit, not yet. He drops and stays down, and a body falls across his back, and then another. And he lies in the frozen mud beneath the weight of men he ate breakfast with that morning. He does not move. He does not breathe more than he has to. And here is part that never leaves you once you know it. When the shooting stops, the Germans walk into the field. They walk among the bodies, and whenever they hear a groan, or see a shoulder shift, or notice a man's breath fogging in the cold, they put a pistol to his head and finish him. They are laughing while they do it. Survivor after survivor testified to that, under oath years later, in a courtroom with their hands shaking. The thing they remembered was not the guns. It was the laughter above them while they played dead. Somewhere near Larry, a man is praying out loud, screaming, praying. There is a shot. The praying stops. Virgil Leary lies in that field for what feels like a lifetime, under the weight of his friends, listening to men be executed one at a time, waiting for a pair of boots to stop beside his own head, and then a shot cracks close by, and something sears through his foot. He does not make a sound. Think about that. None of us knows what we would have done, but we know what he did. A man is shot through the foot while lying under corpses in freezing mud. And he swallows it, because the sound would have been the last sound he ever made. Eventually, the tanks grind away. Eventually, the field goes quiet. And eventually, from somewhere side, he got dead Americans, a voice. And to this day, nobody is entirely certain whose, says two words. Let's go. And the field stands up. Men who had been dead for an hour come out from under the bodies and run. For the woods, for the cafe, for the ditch. And the German rear guard sees them and opens up again. And some of them go down for the last time, and some of them make it. Larry makes the tree line. Larry, on a foot that is no longer a foot, drags himself off ways and keeps going and does not stop. And eventually he finds a road, and eventually the road finds Malmedy. At least 84 Americans stayed in that field. Some accounts say 86. Historians argue about it still, and there is something sustained in that the final unresolved question of these men's lives is how many of them there were. But the number is not the point. Here it is the point. 4 hours, one morning. One morning is all that separates Büllingen from Baugnez. The same tanks, the same column, the same commander, the same day. And the sun did not even go between them. In the early hours of that morning, American prisoners were forced to pour gasoline into those engines with their bare hands, while the crews stood on the decks and cheered. Before that same afternoon was old, those same engines carried those same tanks to a crossroads where American prisoners were machine-gunned in a field and finished off with pistols while they lay pretending to be dead. The fuel that carried the killers to the killing ground was loaded by the men who were killed. There is a temptation to reach for metaphor here, and metaphor would be a lie. This is not a symbol. This is not literature. That is simply what happened on the 7th of December, 1944, in the space of a single morning and afternoon, in a country the size of Maryland, the funnel, and then the field. Now, but Joachim Peiper made a great many mistakes on the road to Antwerp. But the massacre at Baugnez was not only a crime. It was the single most self-destructive act of his entire life, because Virgil Larry got up, and so did roughly 40 others, and they went north, limping, bleeding, half out of their minds, until they stumbled into the town of Malmedy and into the path of a 27-year-old lieutenant colonel named David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. Pergrin was an engineer. He built bridges and blew them up. On the morning of the 17th, he had about 180 men in Malmedy, no armor, no artillery, and no orders that made any sense. So, he had done what a certain kind of American officer does, and gone out toward the sound of the guns in a jeep with one sergeant, just to see for himself. And out of the woods came the survivors. He got them into cover, he got them warm, he got their story, and then he got it on the radio. Within hours, it was at 1st Army headquarters. Within a day, it was everywhere. Division to regiment, regiment to battalion, battalion to company, company to the man in the hole. In command posts and aid stations and truck cabs and foxholes across the entire American front, one sentence traveled faster than any tank in Europe. They shot the prisoners at Malmedy. Now understand what terror was supposed to do. That was the theory of the entire operation. You punch through, you move fast. You frighten the enemy so badly that his rear area troops break and run rather than fight. And the roads open up in front of you. What actually happened was the exact opposite. American units that would have surrendered when surrounded up now did not surrender. Cooks picked up rifles. Clerks dug in. Truck drivers held roadblocks. Engineers who had never fired a shot in anger in their lives stood in the way of tank columns and did not move, because every American on that front had heard what happened in that field, and every American on that front had run the numbers on what surrendering to the SS was now worth. The word went out, and the line hardened. It hardened in front of him. It hardened behind him. It hardened on both flanks. He had spent the money stealing CLC to Bassas speed, and then, in one afternoon, with his own hands, he manufactured an enemy that would not step aside, would not run, and would not raise its hands. He needed open roads. He had just guaranteed that every American between him and Antwerp would rather die in one than give it up. And now the cruelest fact in the whole campaign. There is no way to soften it, and there is nothing to do with it but look at it. 50,000 gallons at Büllingen. That was the prize. That was what the cheering was for. That was what he broke his orders and left his assigned route to seize. Between Spa and Stavelot, a few miles from line of march, sitting in the woods, essentially undefended, were fuel depots 2 and 3 of the U.S. First Army. More than 3 million gallons. Not 50,000. 3 million. Enough gasoline to drive Kampfgruppe paper to Antwerp and back again. Enough to run the entire northern wing of the German offensive for weeks. Enough, arguably, to change the shape of that winter and the shape of the year after it. It sat there, in cans, under the trees. He never knew it existed. He drove past it. He drove past it while his tanks ran dry. He drove past it while his crews were siphoning fuel out of disabled vehicles and shoving empty half-tracks off the road to keep the column moving. He drove past it while he was tearing at the map, hunting for gasoline, spending men's lives at a crossroads for a crumb, while the loaf lay in the woods behind the next ridge guarded by nobody. That is not tragedy. Tragedy needs a flaw and a fall. This is colder than that. This is a man drowning 6 inches beneath the surface in the dark, thrashing, and never once knowing which way was up. Francorchamps. An American major named Paul Solis has a fuel dump and a problem. The Germans are coming up the road. He has nothing that can stop a tank, and behind him sit 124,000 gallons of gasoline that must not be captured. The road runs downhill in a cut, with steep banks on either side. And Solis makes a decision that is in no manual ever written. He orders the cans opened and the fuel poured out. Down the road, into the cut, thousands upon thousands of gallons of gasoline running downhill across the surface of the highway. And then it needs a light. A Belgian soldier named Robert Lemaire of the 5th Fusilier Battalion volunteers is. Stop and look at that man for a second, because he is not in the movies and he ought to be. He is not American. He owes nobody in that column anything. He is a Belgian in his own country, a country that was occupied once already and is about to be occupied again, and he is being asked to walk toward a lake of gasoline with fire in his hand. He does it. The fuel goes up. Now, you should also know that the historians argue. Michael Reynolds, among others, has questioned the legend. Whether there really was a towering wall of flame, whether the German column truly recoiled from a curtain of fire, or whether the story grew in the telling, the way war stories do around a stove 20 years later. Fine. Let them argue. Here is what nobody argues about. The gasoline burned, the Germans did not, and Joachim Peiper, a man whose entire war had become a countdown against an empty tank, went on starving, within a few miles almost more fuel than he could have burned in a month. Now the arithmetic. The real arithmetic. The reason all of this was always going to end the way it ended. A King Tiger, the 69-ton monster at the heart of Peiper's spearhead, burns roughly 2 gallons of gasoline to travel 1 mile. That is on roads, that is on good ground in good weather. The Ardennes in December is not good ground. It is ice, mud, hairpins, gradients, and traffic jams, where 600 vehicles sit idling nose to tail on a single track road for hours, burning fuel while going absolutely nowhere. So take the 50,000 gallons, divide by 600 vehicles. Now factor the hills and the idling. It is not a campaign's worth of fuel. It is not even a week's. It's a few hours of marching. That is the prize. That is what the cheering was for. That is what he abandoned his route for. What he stood in a field for. What he was still congratulating himself on when he reached the crossroads at Baugnes. A few hours of road. And now set that against this. When the American command at Spa learned the great fuel dumps were threatened, there was no panic. There is no record of anyone treating it as a catastrophe. They simply gave the order, destroy them if necessary. Burn 3 million gallons, fine, burn it. There is more. That is the entire war in a single sentence. On one side, an army counting every last 5-gallon can, killing for a few hours of movement. On the other, an army that could order 3 million gallons a sight and then go back to its coffee. Peiper did not lose to a better tank. There was no better tank than his. He lost to a supply chain that reached back across 3,000 miles of ocean, and to a country that could afford to burn what he was willing to murder for. Trois Ponts. The name means 3 bridges. It is a village where the roads converge and the rivers must be crossed, and it is the doorway, the last good doorway, that Peiper needs in order to break into open country and run for the Meuse. Company C of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion is there. They are not infantry. They are not armor. They are men with wrenches and wire and detonators, and on the morning of December 18th, they know exactly one thing that matters: how to make a bridge stop being a bridge. They rig the spans. They wait. They watch the road east. And when the great steel column of Kampfgruppe Pieper comes grinding down toward the water, panthers, king tigers, half-tracks, guns, the spearhead of the last German offensive of the Second World War. One American anti-tank gun opens fire, a single 57mm piece pushed out to cover the road. A weapon that has almost no chance against what is coming. It fires anyway, it hits the lead tank. And then the German guns find it, and the crew is killed at their post, and the gun goes silent forever. That was the last shot fired to defend Trois Ponts. Everything after it was done with wire. Because the engineers hit the plungers, and the bridges go into the river. And the most powerful armored force on Earth stops dead on the wrong side of a small Glen River, and turns, and goes looking for another way. Burning fuel it does not have. Down roads it never planned for. Deeper into a country that is closing behind it like a fist. The clock that Pieper has been losing since Lanzerath is nearly out of hours. And the dead men in the field at Baugnez are about to catch up out of the snow and finish him. There is a moment in every campaign when the commander stops believing. It rarely happens where you would expect. It does not happen at the burning fuel dump. It does not happen when the bridges go into the river. Those are setbacks, and a man like Joachim Pieper had spent 5 years yearning sacks into medals. The moment came quietly, and he told the Americans about it himself, after the war. In an interrogation report taken by the Army's Office of the Chief of Military History, Pieper, Statescript Albits, at which the truth arrived. It came, he said, when they began to realize that they did not have enough gasoline to get across the bridge west of Stomont. Not the war, not Meuse, not Antwerp, a bridge, one bridge, a few miles ahead, on the road he was already standing on. That is where it broke. Not in a great collapse of vision, but in the small, humiliating arithmetic of a man who suddenly understands that the machines under his hand cannot reach the next thing he can see with his own eyes. Everything after that was funeral arrangements. La Glaise, a stone village in a fold of the hills, a church with squawk tower, houses built to hold heat in a hard winter. Pieper backs his command into it because there is nowhere else to go. The roads west are closed. The roads north are closed. The Americans are pressing in from 3 sides with artillery. That never seems to run out of shells because it never does. His tanks are still magnificent. That is the obscene part. The Panthers still work. The King Tigers are still, gun for gun and plate for plate, the most terrifying armored vehicles in Europe. They just cannot move. He radios for fuel. And the Luftwaffe, what is left of it, what can still get airborne with the gasoline it does not have either, sends aircraft to drop supplies on La Glaise. The canisters come down through the overcast, and most of them fall outside the perimeter. Picture that. Picture the men in the cellars of La Glaise watching German parachutes drift down over the tree line, watching their own gasoline float gently away into American hands to be picked up by American soldiers who did not need it and did not want it and had more of it than they could carry. The Third Reich reached out one last time to feed its finest its arms spearhead, and it missed. Inside the village, Pieper has prisoners. Among them a young American major named Hal McCown, taken in the fighting outside Stomont, a serious, watchful officer who will spend several days at very close quarters with the man who ordered the crossroads. And on one of those nights, in a cellar in a dying village, with the American shells walking through the streets above them, the two of them talk. They talk for hours. McCown, who owed him nothing, wrote afterward about what that was like. About a man who was intelligent, magnetic, absolutely certain of himself. A believer. Not a monster with fangs. Worse than that. A man of intelligence and charm who had put both of them entirely at the service of something monstrous, and who could sit in a cellar in the last hours of his command and still speak of the future of Germany as if it were a thing that could be argued into existence. Above them, the artillery keeps falling. Around them, the finest tanks in the world sits in the streets with empty tanks, going nowhere, waiting to be abandoned. That is the picture. Hold on to it. A true believer, underground, talking about victory, surrounded by machines that cannot move. The night of December 23rd, In the small dark hours, Christmas Eve begins, and Joachim Peiper gives the only order left to him. He abandons the tanks, all of them, every Panther, every King Tiger, every half-track, every gun, the spearhead of the German offensive, the hammer that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 48 hours and Antwerp in a week, is left standing in the streets and the fields of a Belgian village. And the men who crewed them walk away on foot, around 800 of them. They go out at night, into the woods, in the snow, in small groups, carrying rifles and nothing else. They cross rivers on foot in December water. They walk for days. Some of them die. Some of them are taken. How many started this? The sources fight about it. Some put the original strength of Kampfgruppe Peiper somewhere between 4,800 and 5,000 men. Peiper himself, afterward, claimed around 3,000. Fewer than 800 walked out of those woods. That was what was left of the tip of Hitler's spear. Not a division, not a regiment. A column of exhausted men on foot, carrying rifles, walking home in the snow. And when the Americans finally walked into La Glazes, they found what he had left behind. 28 tanks, SETI half-tracks, 25 guns. They had tried to destroy them before they fell. That is the detail that finishes you. They ran out of time and explosives before they ran out of tanks. So the Americans came into La Glaise and found them standing in the streets, not shot to pieces, not burned out. Some of them still perfectly capable of killing, hatches open, snow gathering on the engine decks, as though the crews had stepped away for a moment and never come back. Hitler's most elite armored force, the tip of the spear, the men who had been given the honor of leading the last great offensive of the Third Reich, walked home. They walked home through the snow, and they left the most powerful tanks on Earth standing in a Belgian village like abandoned farm equipment. Now the story turns, and it comes back for the man in the field. Dachau, 1946. Dachau, 1946. The Americans, the trial inside the camp itself. 74 defendants, SS men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, sitting in rows, each with a number on a placard hung around his neck, and at the center of them, calm, upright, still handsome, still perfectly composed, Joachim Peiper. And into that courtroom walks a first lieutenant of American Field Artillery, Virgil Larry, the man who lay under the bodies of his friends at Bognes while pistols went off above him. The man who was shot through the foot and did not make a sound. The man who crawled out of that field on a ruined leg because someone said, "Let's go." He is asked to walk the line of the accused, to say which of these men he saw in that field. And Virgil Larry walks down that line. Understand what is happening in that room. He is not looking at a photograph. He is not pointing at a name on a page. He is walking on the foot they shot, past living men who stood over him in that field. Men who were laughing while they finished off his friends. And he is Banks asked to look each of them in the eyes. He stops, and he raises his hand, and he points. The circle closes. Kingston, who was left toward dead in a field of Emmelsbeld, stands up in a courtroom in Germany and puts Sigriff in the face of the man who put him there. That is the last clean moment in this story. Because what happens next is not justice. What happens next is one of the ugliest things America ever did to its own dead. The court hands down 43 death sentences, Peiper among them, and then nothing happens. The men are moved to Landsberg prison. The gallows wait. And in the meantime, questions begin to be raised about the interrogations, about mock trials, about hoods, about the methods used by American investigators to extract the confessions. Some of the allegations were serious. Some were invented. Some were amplified by people who had every interest in the Malmedy verdicts falling apart, because a new enemy was rising in the east, and the men in the dock were suddenly, conveniently, Germans who had fought Russians. And then a young senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy took up the cause. He made it a public spectacle. He made it about American brutality. He turned a hearing about murdered American soldiers into an inquisition of the men who had investigated the murders of American soldiers. The sentences began to come down. Death became life. Life became years. Years became time served. And in the end, hold this, Not one man was ever hanged for what happened in that field at Baugnez. Not one. 84 Americans, or 86, standing in the snow with their hands up, and nobody swung. Joachim Peiper walked out of prison at the end of December 1956, after 11 and a half years. He was 41 years old. He had a life ahead of him. He went to work in the automobile industry. A man who had been condemned to death for the murder of unarmed prisoners, drawing a salary, going home at night, sleeping in a bed. The men in that field were 20 years old, most of them. They got nothing. He did not stay in Germany forever. The past has a way of following a man like that. The Zabers learn who he is. The letters start. The doors close. So in the early 70s, Joachim Peiper moved to France, to a quiet house in the woods outside a village called Treves in the Haute-Saône, and settled down among trees in a country his army had once occupied, and tried to become nobody, and for a while it worked. Until the summer of 1976, when somebody found out. His name got into a French newspaper. The threats began. Friends told him to leave. He would not. The night of the 13th and 14th of July, 1976, the eve of Auspicial Day, the French national holiday, the night, the whole country celebrates the end of tyranny. His house burned down. Gasoline. They came in the dark, and they threw firebombs, and the house went up in the trees outside Treves, and when the ashes cooled, what was left of a man in the wreckage, burned beyond recognition, identified by what remained. A group calling itself the Afterward claimed responsibility. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever tried. France looked at the case, and France looked away. So let us be plain about the shape of this. Joachim Peiper's entire war was decided by gasoline. Gasoline he did not have. Gasoline he took from prisoners and cheered over. Gasoline that burned in a road at Francorchamps so that he could not drink it. Gasoline that ran out west of Stoumont and told him it was finished. 32 years later, in the dark, in a wood in France, gasoline came back for him. Nobody planned that. Nobody wrote it. It simply happened, the way things sometimes do, and there is not a screenwriter alive who would dare in a script. Go to L'Église today. It is a small village in the Ardennes. There is a church. There are stone houses. There are old men who remember, and their grandchildren who do not. And there, in the open air, at the side of the road, sits a King Tiger tank, 69 tons of it. Still there. 80 years of Belgian reign, and it has not moved an inch. Children climb on it in the summer. Tourists stop their cars and get out and stand under that gun barrel and take photographs and feel very small. And every year, somebody asks the same question. They look at the armor, thick as a man's hand. They look at the 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman at 1.5 miles. They look at the sheer, absurd, terrifying engineering of the thing, and they ask the guide the only question that makes any sense. How does something like this get left behind? And the answer is 2 words. No fuel. That is it. That is the whole story. The most powerful tank in the world, in the hands of the most decorated armored commander in the German army, at the head of the most elite division in the Waffen-SS, parked in a Belgian village, hatches open snow on the deck, and left where it stood, while 18 men on a hill above Lanzerath, and a colonel of engineers, St. Malmedy, and a company of sappers with wire and detonators at Trois Ponts, and a Belgian with a torch at Francorchamps, and a lieutenant who crawled out of a field of dead men on a shot-through foot, took the one thing he could never replace, not his tanks, his hours,